move on a bit. One thing which is quite significant and different about this model, and this might seem a very strange idea perhaps here, but let's see, is that once you become an advanced skills teacher, you have 1 day a week to go to a different school. That's called outreach. So 20% of your time is to go out and help other teachers improve their teaching. And this has proved to be a very highly effective way of disseminating good practice and taking practice around a number of schools. It's expensive. Teachers who do this get rewarded and they get retained over time. So it does cost to do this if your system wants to introduce it. It's comparable to becoming almost a principal to take on this role. So it's an attractive role, but with lots of responsibility. How do you identify the best teachers and everyone think it's fair? That is quite a challenge. The system in England, for example, is that such a teacher has to be nominated by their head teacher, has to put together a portfolio of evidence, has to be assessed by an external assessor. They come for 2 days, they watch their teaching, they interview students, they interview parents, they interview the senior management team. So it's a very rigorous process to actually say who can be called this advanced skills teacher. So quite demanding. And it only lasts 5 years. So after 5 years, you have to be reaccredited to carry on. So we found in our little bit of research that the policy, the idea of trying to identify inspirational teachers and keep them in the classroom, have been quite a success. But as I pointed out, if you want to introduce a model, it'll be different to that one. So Australia actually has been doing this for longer. Back in the 1980s, Australia, which is a federal system with different states, brought in their own version of the advanced skills teacher. And their experience then is now nearly 30 years. And they found essentially that if you want to have a system like this, you have to have a system which really helps those teachers maintain their knowledge, stay at the top of the profession, and also provides rewards. Our rewards in Australia have been mostly economic. But in some of the other systems you'll see in a minute, it's more about status than reward. So in fact, in a couple of the states in Australia, after a few years of doing it, they scrapped the scheme and said, we don't think it's very good. So none of these things are permanent. They're ways of exploring what we mean by inspirational teachers and what we mean about keeping them in the classroom to be highly effective. So as I say, some schemes have gone, some have been improved. Also, they feel that their system is a bit too generic. Most teachers are very specific in what they do. They're a secondary mathematics teacher, or they're a primary teacher who prefers to teach the early years. And sometimes standards don't capture that subtlety and that sophistication. So, for example, in the USA, the system of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards is rather different. It is a standards-based system. This is where you produce the highly accomplished teacher. And they have over 25 different certificates which acknowledge different levels of specialist skill. So it might be language arts, it might be junior maths, and so on. So it's much more subject and age range specific. And again, there's been lots of research about what difference it's made. And one of the differences it does make over time is that those certified teachers are able to make more difference to student outcomes. The most recent report actually was interesting because it said, yes, you can show some benefit to test scores, but what we found most interesting was the things that very, very good teachers do are very hard to measure. That sounds very simplistic, but that's an important finding because it's not all about the test scores. We know that very good teachers do far, far more that's very beneficial to students, but it's very hard to capture and document in some neat way. It's far too complex for that. Again, in a country as vast as the US, it's a relatively small scheme. I think the last figures are something like 100,000 teachers out of a vast workforce. So at the moment, these schemes, the ones I've talked about so far, you might call them elite. There's only a few teachers can qualify. This is the latest scheme. Very interesting one, I think. This is from Scotland, a small country with a small system. They had a look at all the other systems around the world and decided they didn't particularly think they were what they wanted. So they've come up with something called the Chartered Teacher Scheme. This is a bit like being a chartered accountant or chartered engineer. It's a status in the profession. And they felt that they wanted all teachers to aspire to being outstanding teachers and to becoming chartered teachers. So it's not for the few, it's for the many. It's also administered by an independent professional body, the General Teaching Council for Scotland. So it's outside government, outside the control of any head teacher. It's quite separate. It's a career structure. It's quite staged. You become eligible for it, and after a while, you join the program. The program lasts 3 or 4 years before you qualify. The difference is this. In a small system, within a couple of years, a couple of thousand teachers are already qualified as chartered teachers. So it's been much more effective in attracting teachers to be identified as these inspiring teachers and to take on that role. It's, I think, a better system than Australia or England, but it still has an economic incentive. There still is a pay rise, which must be important. So I think I'll move to longer term. What are the implications of all this for the teachers for tomorrow? The theme of the conference is schools for tomorrow, and they absolutely depend on the teachers for tomorrow. So, it's quite clear that around the world, education systems are saying, yes, we want these passionate, inspiring, committed teachers, but how do we keep them in the classroom? And how do we make them into effective leaders of teaching and learning? Which is probably not quite the same thing as being a principal. Principals, of course, want to influence teaching and learning, but they've also got to run the school budget, the school grounds. What about those teachers who are identified as focusing on improving the system for its teachers and through its teachers? And what's emerged is that these models across the world can be quite easily compared to each other. They've got lots of things in common, but they are all a bit different. So if Beaconhouse wants to introduce a model like this, it will be its own version, and it will have the advantage of following on from several systems that have already tried things out. All the research of the last 20 years has gradually narrowed down to saying the really key differential is the teacher. Now, if that seems a bit obvious, it's worth saying that wasn't the thinking 30 to 20 years ago, which was about, broadly put, school improvement through external validation. Now, my earlier colleagues' comments about the Beaconhouse system look perfectly appropriate to me. I'm sure that kind of system will be very helpful in evaluating the whole school. But in the end, it's individual teachers that want to be evaluated. They want to see how inspiring they're being and how effective they're being. And they are the key difference. So I'm saying not so much inspiration, perhaps a bit more perspiration. By that I mean being a very good teacher over a long time is incredibly demanding. It's incredibly demanding not only intellectually, but emotionally and physically. It's a tough, demanding profession. It's very rewarding, it's very fulfilling. We get lots back from our children, our students. But there's lots of evidence that teachers go up and down in effectiveness. There are peaks and there are troughs. So they may be doing very well one year and next year not be doing quite so well. That's not a reason for saying they're not doing well over their career, but it is a reason for saying what sustains teachers longer term. What adds to their role? What adds to their status? What adds to their sense of efficacy and well-being? And one of the issues we have in the profession, and this is true all over the world, is that when you start to say, well, this person really is a very good or expert teacher, it begins to make explicit what we mean. What is it that we mean? If it is those, say, characteristics from Hattie I put up earlier, then we know what we're talking about. And that is not quite the same as having a lot of external standards, because no teacher probably does all those things to the same level as you'd expect. So each teacher is individually different. So what you want is something like this, which is guidelines about what we all recognize as the best teaching, of which inspiration, passion, enthusiasm is one characteristic, but one amongst quite a large number. I think the other thing it does demonstrate is that inspiration is not something you get up in the morning and you have a drink of inspiration and you're fine for the day. It's a learnt thing. To stay inspiring, to stay enthusiastic, to keep students believing when they walk in your classroom as the start of the year, and this is another class, you've been teaching for 20 years, it's another class of whatever age it is, that you are their best teacher. That takes much more than, superficial inspiration. It takes a learnt way of engaging with those students. And by having an explicit model, it helps us all see what we mean. I think it also means that systems have to stand back and say, once we've got our good teachers, or once we've developed our good teachers, how is it that over a long time they feel they're developing? They feel they're being recognized. And that's not the same, is it, as performance management. When someone comes in to say, yep, I've ticked these boxes and you're doing fine. It's much more about recognition of specialist skill, specialist opportunity, capacity to help lots of people. I started off with a little aside, a little joke about, do doctors have inspiration? Do lawyers have inspiration? And I think we all agreed that they probably do, but that's not what we talk about when